Ferdinand Lassalle and Helene von Donniges. Volume 3 of Famous Affinities of History. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Famous Affinities of History by Lyndon. Volume 3. Ferdinand Lassalle and Helene von Donniges. The middle part of the 19th century is a period which has become more or less obscure to most Americans and Englishmen. At one end, the thunderous campaigns of Napoleon are dying away. In the latter part of the century, we remember the gorgeousness of the Tuileries, the 4-year strife of our own civil war, and then the golden rift of peace with which the century ended. Between these two extremes, there is a stretch of history which seems to lack interest for the average student of today. In America, that was a period when we took little interest in the movement of affairs on the continent of Europe. It would not be easy, for instance, to imagine an American of 1840 cogitating on problems of socialism or trying to invent some new form of Arbeiterverein. General Choke was still swindling English emigrants. The young Columbian was still darting out from behind a table to declare how thoroughly he defined the British lion. But neither of these patriots, any more than their English compeers, was seriously disturbed about the interests of the rest of the world. The Englishman was contentedly singing "God Save the Queen." The American was apostrophizing the bird of freedom with the floridity of rhetoric that reached its climax in the Pogrom Defiance. What the Dutchies and Frenchies were doing was little more to an Englishman than to an American. Continental Europe was a mystery to English-speaking people. Those who travelled abroad took their own servants with them, spoke only English, and went through the whole European maze with absolute indifference. To them, the socialist, who had scarcely received a name, was an imaginary being. If he existed, he was only a sort of offspring of the Napoleonic Wars, a creature who had not yet fitted into the ordinary course of things. He was an anomaly, a person who howled in beer houses and who would presently be regulated either by the statesmen or by the police. When our old friend Mark Tapley was making with his master a homeward voyage to Britain, what did he know or even care about the politics of France or Germany or Austria or Russia? Not the slightest, you may be sure. Mark and his master represented the complete indifference of the Englishman or American. Not necessarily a well-bred indifference, but an indifference that was insular on the one hand and republican on the other. If either of them had heard of a gentleman who pillaged an unmarried lady's luggage in order to secure a valuable paper for another lady who was married, they would both have looked severely at this abnormal person, and the American would doubtless have added a remark which had something to do with the matchless purity of Columbia's daughters. If, again, they had been told that Ferdinand Lassalle had joined in the great movement initiated by Karl Marx, it is absolutely certain that neither the Englishman nor the American could have given you the slightest notion as to who these individuals were. Thrones might be tottering all over Europe. The red flag might wave in a score of cities. What would all this signify so long as Britannia ruled the waves while Columbia's feathered emblem shrieked defiance 3,000 miles away? And yet, few more momentous events have happened in a century than the union which led one man to give his eloquence to the social cause and the other to suffer for that cause until his death. Marx had the higher thought, but his disciple, Lassalle, had the more attractive way of presenting it. It is odd that Marx today should lie in a squalid cemetery while the whole Western world echoes with his praises, and that Lassalle, brilliant, clear-sighted, and remarkable for his penetrating genius, should have lived in luxury but should now know nothing but oblivion even among those who shouted at his eloquence and ran beside him in the glory of his triumph. Ferdinand Lassalle was a native of Breslau, the son of a wealthy Jewish silk merchant. Hermann Lassalle, for thus the father spelled his name, stroked his hands at young Ferdinand's cleverness, but he meant it to be a commercial cleverness. He gave the boy a thorough education at the University of Breslau and later at Berlin. He was an affectionate parent and at the same time tyrannical to a degree. It was the old story where the father wishes to direct every step that his son takes, and where the son, bursting out into youthful manhood, feels that he has the right to freedom. The father thinks how he has toiled for the son. The son thinks that if this toil were given for love, it should not be turned into a fetter and restraint. Young Lassalle, instead of becoming a clever silk merchant, insisted on a university career where he studied earnestly and was admitted to the most cultured circles. Though his birth was Jewish, he encountered little prejudice against his race. Napoleon had changed the old anti-Semitic feeling of 50 years before to a liberalism that was just beginning to be strongly felt in Germany as it had already been in France. This was true in general, but especially true of Lassalle, whose features were not of a Semitic type, who made friends with everyone, and who was a favorite in many salons. His portraits make him seem a high-bred and high-spirited Prussian with an intellectual and clean-cut forehead, a face that has a sense of humor, and yet one capable of swift and cogent thought. No man of ordinary talents could have won the admiration of so many compeers. It is not likely that such a keen and cynical observer as Heinrich Heine would have written as he did concerning Lassalle, had not the latter been a brilliant and magnetic youth. Heine wrote to Varnhagen von Ense, the German historian, "My friend Herr Lassalle, who brings you this letter, is a young man of remarkable intellectual gifts, with the most thorough erudition, with the widest learning, with the greatest penetration that I have ever known, and with the richest gift of exposition. He combines an energy of will and a capacity for action which astonish me. In no one have I found united so much enthusiasm and practical intelligence." No better proof of Lassalle's enthusiasm can be found than a few lines from his own writings. "I love Heine. He is my second self. What audacity! What overpowering eloquence! He knows how to whisper like a zephyr when it kisses rose blooms, how to breathe like fire when it rages and destroys. He calls forth all that is tenderest and softest, and then all that is fiercest and most daring. He has the sweep of the whole lyre." Lassalle's sympathy with Heine was like his sympathy with everyone whom he knew. This was often misunderstood. It was misunderstood in his relations with women, and especially in the celebrated affair of the Countess von Hatzfeld, which began in the year 1846, that is to say, in the 21st year of Lassalle's age. In truth, there was no real scandal in the matter, for the Countess was twice the age of Lassalle. It was precisely because he was so young that he let his eagerness to defend a woman in distress make him forget the ordinary usage of society and expose himself to mean and unworthy criticism which lasted all his life. It began by his introduction to the Countess von Hatzfeld, a lady who was grossly ill-treated by her husband. She had suffered insult and imprisonment in the family castles. The Count had deprived her of medicine when she was ill, and had forcibly taken away her children. Besides this, he was infatuated with another woman, a baroness, and wasted his substance upon her, even contrary to the law which protected his children's rights. The Countess had a son named Paul, of whom Lassalle was extremely fond. There came to the boy a letter from the Count von Hatzfeld, ordering him to leave his mother. The Countess at once sent for Lassalle, who brought with him two wealthy and influential friends, one of them a judge of a high Prussian court, and together they read the letter which Paul had just received. They were deeply moved by the despair of the Countess and by the cruelty of her dissolute husband in seeking to separate the mother from her son. In his chivalrous ardor, Lassalle swore to help the Countess, and promised that he would carry on the struggle with her husband to the bitter end. He took his 2 friends with him to Berlin, and then to Düsseldorf, for they discovered that the Count von Hatzfeld was not far away. He was, in fact, at Aix-la-Chapelle with the Baroness. Lassalle, who had the scent of a greyhound, pried about until he discovered that the Count had given his mistress a legal document, assigning to her a valuable piece of property which, in the ordinary course of law, should be entailed on the boy, Paul. The Countess at once hastened to the place, broke into her husband's room, and secured a promise that the deed would be destroyed. No sooner, however, had she left him than he returned to the Baroness, and presently it was learned that the woman had set out for Cologne. Lassalle and his 2 friends followed, to ascertain whether the document had really been destroyed. The 3 reached a hotel at Cologne where the Baroness had just arrived. Her luggage, in fact, was being carried upstairs. One of Lassalle's friends opened a trunk and, finding a casket there, slipped it out to his companion, the judge. Unfortunately, the latter had no means of hiding it, and when the Baroness's servants shouted for help, the casket was found in the possession of the judge, who could give no plausible account of it. He was, therefore, arrested, as were the other 2. There was no evidence against Lassalle, but his friends fared badly at the trial, one of them being imprisoned for a year, and the other for 5 years. From this time, Lassalle, with an almost quixotic devotion, gave himself up to fighting the Countess von Hatzfeld's battle against her husband in the law courts. The ablest advocates were pitted against him. The most eloquent legal orators thundered at him and at his client, but he met them all with a skill, an audacity, and a brilliant wit that won for him verdict after verdict. The case went from the lower to the higher tribunals until, after 9 years, it reached the last court of appeal, where Lassalle wrested from his opponents a magnificently conclusive victory, one that made the children of the Countess absolutely safe. It was a battle fought with the determination of a soldier, with the gallantry of a knight-errant, and the intellectual acumen of a learned lawyer. It is not surprising that many refused to believe that Lassalle's feeling toward the Countess von Hatzfeld was a disinterested one. A scandalous pamphlet which was published in French, German, and Russian, and written by one who styled herself Sophie Solutzov, did much to spread the evil report concerning Lassalle. But the very openness and frankness of the service which he did for the Countess ought to make it clear that his was the devotion of a youth drawn by an impulse into a strife where there was nothing for him to gain but everything to lose. He denounced the brutality of her husband, but her letters to him always addressed him as "my dear child." In writing to her, he confides small love secrets and ephemeral flirtations which he would scarcely have done had the Countess viewed him with the eye of passion. Lassalle was undoubtedly a man of impressionable heart, and had many affairs such as Heine had, but they were not deep or lasting. That he should have made a favourable impression on the women whom he met is not surprising, because of his social standing, his chivalry, his fine manners, and his handsome face. Mr. Clement Shorter has quoted an official document which describes him as he was in his earlier years. Ferdinand Lassalle, aged 23, a civilian born at Breslau and dwelling recently at Berlin. He stands 5 feet 6 inches in height, has brown curly hair, open forehead, brown eyebrows, dark blue eyes, well-proportioned nose and mouth, and rounded chin. We ought not to be surprised, then, if he was a favourite in drawing-rooms, if both men and women admired him, if Alexander von Humboldt cried out with enthusiasm that he was a wunderkind, and if there were more than Sophie Solutzov to be jealous. But the rather ungrateful remark of the Countess von Hatzfeld certainly does not represent him as he really was. "You are without reason and judgment where women are concerned," she snarled at him. But the sneer only shows that the woman who uttered it was neither in love with him nor grateful to him. In this paper, we are not discussing Lassalle as a public agitator or as a socialist, but simply in his relations with the two women who most seriously affected his life. The first was the Countess von Hatzfeld, who, as we have seen, occupied, or rather wasted, 9 of the best years of his life. Then came that profound and thrilling passion which ended the career of a man who at 39 had only just begun to be famous. Lassalle had joined his intellectual forces with those of Heine and Marx. He had obtained so great an influence over the masses of the people as to alarm many a monarch, and at the same time to attract many a statesman. Prince Bismarck, for example, cared nothing for Lassalle's championship of popular rights, but sought his aid on finding that he was an earnest advocate of German unity. Furthermore, he was very far from resembling what in those early days was regarded as the typical picture of a socialist. There was nothing frowsy about him. In his appearance, he was elegance itself. His manners were those of a prince, and his clothing was of the best. Seeing him in a drawing room, no one would mistake him for anything but a gentleman and a man of parts. Hence, it is not surprising that his second love was one of the nobility, although her own people hated Lassalle as a bearer of the red flag. This girl was Helene von Donniges, the daughter of a Bavarian diplomat. As a child, she had travelled much, especially in Italy and in Switzerland. She was very precocious and lived her own life without asking the direction of anyone. At 12 years of age, she had been betrothed to an Italian of 40, but this dark and pedantic person always displeased her, and soon afterward, when she met a young Wallachian nobleman, one Janko Rakowitza, she was already at once to dismiss her Italian lover. Rakowitza, young, a student, far from home, and lacking friends, appealed at once to the girl's sympathy. At that very time, in Berlin, where Helene was visiting her grandmother, she was asked by a Prussian baron, "Do you know Ferdinand Lassalle?" The question came to her with a peculiar shock. She had never heard the name, and yet the sound of it gave her a strange emotion. Baron Korff, who perhaps took liberties because she was so young, went on to say, "My dear lady, have you really never seen Lassalle? Why, you and he were meant for each other." She felt ashamed to ask about him, but shortly after, a gentleman who knew her said, "It is evident that you have a surprising degree of intellectual kinship with Ferdinand Lassalle." This so excited her curiosity that she asked her grandmother, "Who is this person of whom they talk so much, this Ferdinand Lassalle?" "Do not speak of him," replied her grandmother. "He is a shameless demagogue." A little questioning brought to Helene all sorts of stories about Lassalle. The Countess von Hatzfeld, the stolen casket, the mysterious pamphlet, the long battle in the courts, all of which excited her still more. A friend offered to introduce her to the shameless demagogue. This introduction happened at a party, and it must have been an extraordinary meeting. Seldom, it seemed, was there a better instance of love at first sight, or of the true affinity of which Baron Korff had spoken. In the midst of the public gathering, they almost rushed into each other's arms. They talked the free talk of acknowledged lovers. And when she left, he called her love names as he offered her his arm. "Somehow, it did not appear at all remarkable," she afterward declared. "We seem to be perfectly fitted to each other." Nevertheless, 9 months passed before they met again at a soirée. At this time, Lassalle, gazing upon her, said, "What would you do if I were sentenced to death?" "I should wait until your head was severed," was her answer, "in order that you might look upon your beloved to the last. And then I should take poison." Her answer delighted him, but he said that there was no danger. He was greeted on every hand with great consideration. It seemed not unlikely that, in recognition of his influence with the people, he might rise to some high position. The King of Prussia sympathized with him. Heine called him the Messiah of the 19th century. When he passed from city to city, the whole population turned out to do him honor. Houses were wreathed. Flowers were thrown in masses upon him, while the streets were spanned with triumphal arches. Worn out with the work and excitement attending the birth of Deutscher Arbeiterverein, or Workmen's Union, which he founded in 1863, Lassalle fled for a time to Switzerland for rest. Helene heard of his whereabouts and hurried to him with several friends. They met again on July the 25th, 1864, and discussed long and intensely the possibilities of their marriage and the opposition of her parents, who would never permit her to marry a man who was at once a socialist and a Jew. Then comes the pitiful story of the strife between Lassalle and the Donniges family. Helene's father and mother indulged in vulgar words. They spoke of Lassalle with contempt. They recalled all the scandals that had been current 10 years before and forbade Helene ever to mention the man's name again. The next scene in the drama took place in Geneva, where the family of Herr von Donniges had arrived, and where Helene's sister had been betrothed to Count von Keyserling, a match which filled her mother with intense joy. Her momentary friendliness tempted Helene to speak of her unalterable love for Lassalle. Scarcely had the words been spoken when her father and mother burst into abuse and denounced Lassalle as well as herself. She sent word of this to Lassalle, who was in a hotel nearby. Scarcely had he received her letter when Helene herself appeared upon the scene, and with all the intensity of which she was possessed, she begged him to take her wherever he chose. She would go with him to France, to Italy, to the ends of the earth. What a situation! And yet, how simple a one for a man of spirit! It is strange to have to record that to Lassalle it seemed most difficult. He felt that he, or she, or both of them, had been compromised. Had she a lady with her? Did she know anyone in the neighborhood? What an extraordinary answer! If she were compromised, all the more ought he to have taken her in his arms and married her at once, instead of quibbling and showing himself a prig. Presently, her maid came in to tell them that a carriage was ready to take them to the station, whence a train would start for Paris in a quarter of an hour. Helene begged him, with a feeling that was beginning to be one of shame. Lassalle repelled her in words that were to stamp him with a particular kind of cowardice. Why should he have stopped to think of anything except the beautiful woman who was at his feet and to whom he had pledged his love? Why did he care for the petty diplomat who was her father, or the vulgar-tongued woman who was her mother? He should have hurried her and the maid into the train for Paris, and have forgotten everything in the world but his Helene, glorious among women, who had left everything for him. What was the sudden failure, the curious weakness, the paltriness of spirit that came at the supreme moment into the heart of this hitherto strong man? Here was the girl whom he loved, driven from her parents, putting aside all question of appearances, and clinging to him with a wild and glorious desire to give herself to him and to be all his own. That was a thing worthy of a true woman. And he shrinks from her and cowers and acts like a simpleton. His courage seems to have dribbled through his fingertips. He is no longer a man, he is a thing. Out of all the multitude of Lassalle's former admirers, there is scarcely one who has ventured to defend him, much less to laud him. And when they have done so, their voices have had a sound of mockery that dies away in their own throats. Helene, on her side, had compromised herself, and even from the viewpoint of her parents, it was obvious that she ought to be married immediately. Her father, however, confined her to her room until it was understood that Lassalle had left Geneva. Then her family's supplications, the statement that her sister's marriage and even her father's position were in danger, led her to say that she would give up Lassalle. It mattered very little in one way, for whatever he might have done, Lassalle had killed, or at least had chilled, her love. His failure at the moment of her great self-sacrifice had shown him to her as he really was. No bold and gallant spirit, but a cringing, spiritless self-seeker. She wrote him a formal letter to the effect that she had become reconciled to her betrothed bridegroom, and they never met again. Too late, Lassalle gave himself up to a great regret. He went about trying to explain his action to his friends, but he could say nothing that would ease his feeling and reinstate him in the eyes of the romantic girl. In a frenzy, he sought out the Wallachian student, Janko von Rakowitza, and challenged him to a mortal duel. He also challenged Helene's father. Years before, he had, on principle, declined to fight a duel. But now he went raving about as if he sought the death of everyone who knew him. The duel was fought on August the 28th, 1864. There was some trouble about pistols and also about seconds, but finally the combatants left a small hotel in a village near Geneva and reached the dueling grounds. Lassalle was almost joyous in his manner. His old confidence had come back to him. He meant to kill his man. They took their stations high up among the hills. A few spectators saw their figures outlined against the sky. The command to fire rang out, and from both pistols gushed the flame and smoke. A moment later, Lassalle was seen to sway and fall. A chance shot, glancing from a wall, had struck him to the ground. He suffered terribly, and nothing but opium in great doses could relieve his pain. His wound was mortal, and 3 days later, he died. Long after, Helene admitted that she still loved Lassalle, and believed that he would win the duel. But after the tragedy, the tenderness and patience of Rakowitza won her heart. She married him, but within a year he died of consumption. Helene, being disowned by her relations, prepared herself for the stage. She married a third husband named Shevich, who was then living in the United States, but who has since made his home in Russia. Let us say nothing of Lassalle's political career. Except for his work as one of the early leaders of the liberal movement in Germany, it has perished, and his name has been almost forgotten. As a lover, his story stands out forever as a warning to the timid and the recreant. Let men do what they will, but there is just one thing which no man is permitted to do with safety in the sight of woman, and that is to play the craven. End of Ferdinand Lassalle and Helene von Donniges.